Ja, mein Name ist Eva Maurer und ich freue mich sehr, ja, liebe Studierende, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Gäste, ich freue mich wirklich sehr, Sie heute hier begrüßen zu dürfen zum Eröffnungsabend eben der diesjährigen Veranstaltungsreihe der Osteuropa-Bibliothek, die gleichzeitig ein Teil ist der Einführungsveranstaltung in den Studiengang Osteuropa-Studien. Dieses Semester werden wir uns an 6 Abenden mit dem Thema Musik und Nation beschäftigen, quer durch Nord-, Ost- und Südosteuropa bis nach Zentralasien. Und es ist, denke ich, nur ein kleiner Einblick in eine sehr spannende Beziehung, wo wir noch zahlreiche weitere Themen hätten aufgreifen können. Aber ich hoffe, die Referentinnen und Referenten regen Sie auch so ein bisschen zu weiteren Hörreisen an. Wie üblich gilt eben wenn Sie einen Vortrag nicht besuchen können, können Sie ihn als Podcast nachhören. Und auch dieser Podcast wird eben mit der anschließenden Diskussion aufgenommen werden. Ja, Musik und Nation und im weiteren oder eben engeren Sinn Musik und Nationalismus, wie stehen diese beiden Themen eigentlich, diese Themenkomplexe in Beziehung zueinander? Und ich möchte hier nur 3 Aspekte aufgreifen, die im Rahmen der Reihe, denke ich, zur Sprache kommen. Die erste ist eigentlich die Frage nach der symbolischen Repräsentation. Also welche Musik soll das Land repräsentieren und auf welche Weise drückt Musik eigentlich auch etwas Nationales in Anführungszeichen aus. Wenn man über dieses Verhältnis spricht man traditionell oft von Identitäten, vielleicht musikalischen Identitäten, aber man kann natürlich auch von Branding sprechen heutzutage. Welche Musik wird eingesetzt, um ein Land zu repräsentieren? Und am offenkundigsten ist es sicher beim Fall der Nationalhymne, die Sie alle kennen. Da geht es eigentlich darum, ein Lied zu finden, eine Melodie, die den Staat repräsentiert. Und das zeigt sich sehr deutlich, zum Beispiel am Beispiel der heutigen russischen Nationalhymne. Das ist eine Nationalhymne, die es seit Ende des Jahres 2000 gibt oder wieder gibt. Damals hat nämlich Putin quasi als erste Amtshandlung die in den 90er Jahren zwischenzeitlich ersetzte patriotische Melodie, das patriotische Lied von Glinka, durch ein Remake der alten Sowjethymne ersetzt. Also die Sowjethymne, die bis 1993 noch in Kraft war. Es ist die gleiche Melodie und es ist auch Sergei Michalkow, der schon 44 und 77 den Text geschrieben hatte, der wurde reaktiviert aus dem Ruhestand, um den Text der neuen Hymne der Russländischen Föderation wiederzuschreiben. Und diese neuen Worte, also die Anfangszeilen beginnen mit Russland, unser heiliger Staat, die klingen heute natürlich noch etwas unheilverheißender als schon damals. Aber das Spannende ist eigentlich, dass bevor sich Russland 1944 eben, also bevor sich die Sowjetunion 1944 diese Hymne gegeben hat, dass es eigentlich paradoxerweise die internationale war, die vorher die Nationalhymne der Sowjetunion war. Also ein musikalischer Wechsel, der ganz klar auch eben diesen Schritt weg von der Vision der Weltrevolution ausdrückt. Also nicht mehr völkerumspannende Solidarität der Arbeiter, sondern mehr so national orientierter Sowjetpatriotismus und Sowjetsozialismus. Und damit sind wir eigentlich fast beim zweiten Teil, weil Musik als Begleitung oder als Element auch von Ereignissen, insbesondere von Revolutionen, wie die Marseillaise ja auch, ist die internationale eigentlich ein Revolutionslied. Und damit ist sie eigentlich ein Lied des Volkes gegen die Staatsmacht. Ja? Also nicht etwas, was von der Staatsmacht propagiert wird. Und wie wichtig auch wie emotional ist, wichtig und politisch diese Musik in diesen revolutionären Situationen sein kann, das, glaube ich, haben wir in den letzten Jahren immer wieder gesehen. Zuletzt sicher bei den Protesten in Belarus 2020 zum Beispiel, ich weiß nicht, ob Sie die verfolgt haben. Da wurde zum Beispiel ein Song aus den späten 80er Jahren auch immer wieder gespielt von Viktor Tsoi und der Gruppe Kino, Хочу перемен, also ich will einen Wandel. Der wurde vor allem auf den Oppositionsveranstaltungen logischerweise gespielt und für die Opposition. Aber irgendwann gelang es 2 Tontechnikern sogar, den heimlich einzuschleusen in die Playlist für eine Lukaschenko-Ansprache. Die Veranstaltung wurde dann natürlich unterbrochen und für die beiden Tontechniker endete es nicht gut, aber es zeigte wirklich, wie aufgeladen diese musikalischen Elemente waren. Ja, eben, es ist klar, diese Lieder können in diesen revolutionären Momenten Botschaften klar oder verschlüsselt mitteilen, aber es geht ja um viel mehr. Es geht eigentlich auch um dieses kollektive Erleben, was sie transportieren können, um eine Stimmung, die sie transportieren und verstärken können, bis irgendwie diese Melodien zum Schluss auch so verwoben sind mit den Ereignissen und eigentlich wirklich zum emotionalen Tenor der Zeit werden. Ja, Musik begleitet die Politik, das politische Geschehen findet umgekehrt natürlich auch Eingang in die Musik und es kann so musikalische Gemeinschaften schaffen, aber auch eben total auseinander dividieren. Das haben wir nach 2014 mit dem Maidan sehr klar gesehen in der ukrainischen Pop- und Rockszene und der russischen, wo das Verhältnis ausgesprochen problematisch wurde. Und dann wiederum finde ich auch sehr interessant, vielleicht das dritte Element, was wir sehen werden, ist der Zusammenhang mit der Globalisierung. Wir haben eigentlich eine globalisierte Unterhaltungsmusikindustrie und da wird dann so eine Veranstaltung wie der Eurovision Song Contest plötzlich eigentlich zum Spielfeld, zum globalen Spielfeld, wo dann nationale und regionale Konflikte ausgetragen werden sollen. Damit geht es dann auch natürlich wieder um die Frage, wer darf eigentlich so eine Nation musikalisch vertreten, ja, und auf welche Weise und wozu? Wem gehört überhaupt eine gewisse Musik? Also eine sehr aktuelle Frage. Welche Vorstellungen und Assoziationen werden auch mit bestimmten Genres und Interpreten assoziiert? Und welche Gemeinschaften entstehen aus und bilden sich eigentlich um diese musikalischen Kulturen und Subkulturen? Eben, das sind Fragen, die uns heute aktuell beschäftigen, aber sie sind eben eigentlich gar nicht so neu, denke ich, wie wir sehen werden. Wenn wir jetzt über die Oper sprechen, ein westlich-europäisches Genre des 19. und 20. Jahrhunderts, mit dem wir jetzt diese musikalische Reise in diesem Semester beginnen. Ja, damit bin ich mit meinen Vorbemerkungen am Ende und ich freue mich, Ihnen den Referenten heute vorstellen zu können. Dafür werde ich aber auf Englisch wechseln. Ostap Sereda wird etwa 45 Minuten bis eine Stunde sprechen. Nachher können wir eine Fragerunde machen. Fragen, denke ich, können Sie auf Englisch und auf Deutsch stellen. Ja, a very warm welcome from me to you, Ostap Sereda. I'm very happy you made the long trip to us. And I'm happy to introduce you. Ostap Sereda is a historian, first and foremost, I would say, a real historian. He received his PhD from Central European University in Budapest in 2003, and he has also been very connected to this university for many years. He's been a recurring visiting teacher there and is also teaching right now, I think, online for CEU, which is now in Vienna. He's been to many places, but his home base actually is Lviv, where he's been an associate professor at the Department of Modern Contemporary Ukrainian History at the Ukrainian Catholic University since 2016. For almost a year now, he's also been based at the Imre Kertész Kolleg in Jena, where he will be staying until the end of the year, if I understand you correctly. He has a wide range of research and teaching interests, focused mostly on 19th century history of Ukraine and the Central East European borderlands. Forthcoming, there will be a book from Routledge, which he co-authored on intellectual foundations of modern Ukraine in the 19th century. It also has a strong focus on the interplay, I would say, between local, regional, national identities and identity construction and nation building in the 19th century in these East European borderlands, and its connections also, I would say, to the public sphere, which is another of your focus points. And this is something he will be talking about today. He will be talking about musical theater and national politics in Kiev in the 19th century. So now you have the floor. Thank you so very much for coming here.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this kind introduction. I feel really privileged and humbled by this magnificent university building, by being invited to open this wonderful series of lectures, of talks on music and various dimensions of nationalism, let's say, or other processes in Eastern Europe. I have to admit from the very beginning I'm not a scholar of music, neither a scholar of performative arts, as was already said, so a little bit regard my participation as a kind of amateur opening of a huge series, there was a kind of custom sometimes before the beginning of theatrical season that the amateur troupe was invited to perform, to play. Normally university students and professors were involved into that together with professional actresses and singers. And often these amateur plays had actually terrific significance. Nevertheless, my main fields of interest are rather in cultural history, partly in intellectual history, and I will try to look on musical theater in the specific East European context as political representative institution, as a cultural project, also a center of urban sociability through the 19th century. I will try to play a little bit of music, so not to make it only political and historical, but also to share some aesthetic experience with you. But we will also try to look at the musical theater as an interesting factor, phenomenon of the specific context of East European borderlands in the long 19th century. I apologize for not being able to address you in German, in whatever version of German, but my English is, again, in some specific, perhaps Ukrainian or East European version, so if something is too unclear, please don't hesitate to stop me at any point. As you are students of Eastern Europe, I don't need to make an amateur, and as you are interested in East European studies, I don't need to make long geographic introduction into this part of Europe that we'll be talking today about. Today, the country of Ukraine is in the center of political attention because of obvious reasons, because of Russian aggression. Still, if we look at the 19th century, very often these regions are seen as borderlands, are seen as peripheries of 2 or 3 big mainland empires, and very often we see the processes there as being decided, dictated, shaped at the imperial centers, at the real centers of power. So often what is going on somewhere in Zhytomyr or in Kiev is rather perceived through the central imperial lens. It's not that I will try to deconstruct imperial paradigm today, but I'll try to show the importance of local agents, of local actors, in their responses to imperial cultural policies, in their own cultural and political projects. And you obviously see Kiev, or today we use in English Kyiv official name, which is along the river of Dnipro. So this rather pink region is actually the Pale of Settlement, but it also partly coincides, or just partly, with so-called Western province or Western borderlands of the Russian Empire, and specifically Kiev was the center of so-called southwestern province, Yugo-Zapadny Krai in Russian, that consisted of 3 provinces, 3 gubernia, Kyiv, Podolia, Volhynia, adjacent to Habsburg, Austrian border, and the region where actually, maybe for the first time, the imperial system was challenged by a new modern national paradigm. So from the very beginning, I have to say that from the political history and intellectual history of the Russian Empire of the 19th century, the western borderlands, the southwestern borderlands, even if you use the term borderlands province, at some point were very central parts because of Russian-Polish, because of Russian-Ukrainian conflict, because of the importance of Jewish cultural and social life in these regions and necessity to integrate all the various segments of population into imperial system. And very often these conflicts influenced the intellectual and political processes in the capitals. So the turn to official nationality policy, for example, to a great extent were determined by the November uprising of 1830, 1831, and the necessity to start new type of educational, cultural policy across the empire. But I am not only going to talk today about the imperial dimension or national dimension or imperial national conflict. it's also important to see the theater within the urban context, as before the beginning of the 20th century, before the growth of mass entertainment, we all know that this is probably the main side of urban sociability. We still don't have sports by that time, mass sport, we don't have cinema, we don't have other. So there are, of course, other forms of popular entertainment, non-elite entertainment, but still the theatrical space is probably the most integrative to various segments of society. And that's probably the main forum where educated elites and non-educated elites share common emotions, right? Share common responses, sit together at some point. For any city, their theaters are important cultural institutions, and actually we could see connection between the development of new operatic forms, for example, and the growth of modern urban metropolises. So the emergence of grand opera somehow occurred in those rapidly urbanizing metropolises of Europe in the 19th century. For this purpose, it's important to look also on the ethno-social situation in Kiev in the 19th century. It's probably a question whether Kyiv can be classified as a metropolis of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, it's a rather small provincial town, because for a long period it was located on the Polish-Russian border till the partitions of Poland and Lithuania, and rather was insignificant in regard to its population or cultural role, but became increasingly important as symbolic center than as administrative center, and then it experienced rapid urbanization as the hub of growing capitalist industry, sugar trade, and other segments of capitalist industry by the end of the 19th century. So that's a kind of provincial metropolis, provincial metropolitan center, and the musical theater there, it's also interesting as a case of this provincial cultural center, so province and center at the same time. So that's a specific condition of borderland, to be oriented, to be multi-centered in a way, to be oriented not only to one imperial center, but also to competing previous political centers, and also aspire to play independent role. So here we have one drawing from the first half of the 19th century. In the course of the 19th century, Kyiv became the focal point of imperial national contestations, specifically because of the Polish November uprising of 1830-1831, which kind of changes political climate in the empire, and which stimulates the necessity to establish Kyiv as a historical center, to discover pre-Polish past of the region, of the city, as legitimization of Russian possession, Russian imperial possession of these territories that used to belong to Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth till the end of the 18th century. So there is, at some moment, I don't have enough time to get into details, but at some moment in the 1830s, there is an urgent need to examine historical documents to somehow uncover layers of pre-Polish past, often in very mythologized way, or partly fabricated way, but in fact, the pre-Polish past is somehow digged out of the ground, of the soil at some point, as for example in 1830s, so-called golden gates are discovered by the local archaeologists with some support of imperial government, the golden gates from the time of Rurikid princes of Rus. Kyiv is seen as the historical center of historical Russia, so the new symbolic images of the Jerusalem, of Russian lands are coined. Also, the cultural and social setting in Kyiv is quite different at that time. The other important innovation is, of course, establishing of the university in Kyiv in the 1830s as imperial university, which was meant to confirm the Russian intellectual presence in the city and in the region. As it often happens with imperial institutions, they unintentionally play a different role, and universities often unintentionally becoming the centers of alternative public spheres. The same happens here in Kiev. The University of Kiev became the center for many Polish activists, and also became the center of Ukrainian intellectual development. Already in the 1840s, we have a group of romantic Ukrainian intellectuals who are developing modern Ukrainian national idea. The situation in Kyiv as such was quite complex in terms of its ethnic composition, in terms of its linguistic composition, and it also was reflected in the life of the theater. We will see it in a moment. So I have here data from a kind of amateur census organized by a local branch of Geographic Society in 1874, and then from the first all-Russian imperial census in 1897. I don't have enough time to explain how these categories were. If you would be interested, I can explain how these categories were coined and how they were measured. But generally speaking, the results of these two censuses show that the city was quite composite in ethnic and in religious sense. So about 54% of population were Russian-speaking, 20-30 declared to be Ukrainian-speaking. There was considerable, significant group of Yiddish-speaking population, perhaps higher than indicated in the census because of the problems with legal status of Jewish inhabitants of the city. And there was quite considerable number of the Poles, Roman Catholic, and in this case, Polish-speaking part of the population. This Polish presence in the city was kind of constant factor through the 19th century, but especially in the first half of the 19th century. Often when we think about Kyiv, we think about it as Ukrainian capital, we think about it as a city important in Russian historical mythology, Bulgakov or Shevchenko, but we often forget about the Polish presence, and we often think, we know about city as Yegupets, so imagined city in Jewish mental map, but we often forget about the Polish presence there. And let's not forget that these southwestern provinces of Russian Empire are dominated by the Polish landowning class, are dominated by Polish cultural elites. The University of Kyiv, which was established as Russian Imperial University, relies mostly on Polish Roman Catholic students until the 1860s. So through 1840s and 60s, 50-60% of students are Poles, actually. And it also influences how the cultural life in the city is developed. And here finally we come to the theaters, because the theater is an important part of the urban landscape. And this is the first permanent Kyiv theater built around 1804 from wood, so it's wooden. It has some classicist forms, but it occupies rather unchattered part of the city. That's another picture of it. Who would be present in that theater in the initial period? Very much depended on the time of the season, because if it would be the carnival season, January or February, the time of so-called annual fairs, kontrakty, then the city was flooded by the Polish landowners who would come to the city to trade, to exchange, to buy books, to entertain, to establish myriads of various social connections, and so on. And during that time, normally the theater would be taken by the Polish itinerant troupe. Then, in the other parts of the year, and specifically in the autumn, the local inhabitants, town dwellers, would be rather also interested in Ukrainian, Russian, and also Polish plays. Still, Polish is the dominant language of cultural life and educational life in the city of Kyiv, at least in the first third of the 19th century. But for that time, we have this specific situation that the theater is used normally by itinerant theatrical troupes. these theatrical troupes are normally multi-linguistic, so actors or singers who, and that's also interesting, who perform there are able to take part both in Polish, Russian, and also in Ukrainian plays, usually. And some of the plays actually have multilinguistic elements, if they would be based on local material. And also the actors are very universalistic at that time, because we don't have clear division into genres of opera or drama theater or ballet. So all the elements are very much combined. And normally they perform comic operas, vaudevilles, some divertissements with dancing elements. They often perform the newest European operas. For example, Barbara of Sevilla of Rossini would be performed there just 2 years after the premiere of Barbara of Sevilla in Polish translation. And that again would be a big sensation for this carnival gathering, January, February, of local landowning elites. But there would be other different types of musical plays that one could see on the musical stage in Kyiv. From the 1830s, the theater is becoming center of local imperial cultural politics. And we can more and more speak about theater as the side of political representation. And obviously the political role of theater, the political role of opera is not a new subject. There are very important, profound studies of it. I'll just mention maybe a study that appeared a couple of decades ago already by Ruth Barrison, who stressed the role of the kind of ambivalent role of theater, because on the one hand, it's important for legitimization of the power of the state, right? It plays this function of legitimization of certain power, but at the same time, it can be site of political demonstration, of subversive emotions, and specifically when we speak about the 19th century old regime, the theater, and specifically in the conditions of the Russian Empire, the theater is actually the site for various possible public protests, for various uncontrolled ways of behavior. Not only, of course, in the Russian Empire, it happens in Habsburg monarchy as well. We know the theaters are often the sites of assassinations, of political assassinations, and of course we know that in Kiev it also happened, but a little bit later. But still in the 19th century there were several attacks within the theatrical, physical space on some official dignitaries. So theater is important politically. It's actually realized also by the imperial dignitaries already in the 1830s. The first attempts to somehow influence local theatrical politics we can find already at that time. In 1842, for example, the Russian Emperor Nicholas I, the first orders the city to pay every year a certain sum of money to support its Russian drama theater. So normally when we think about theatrical policy, we think about court theater and then city theater. So city, because of the growth of urban class, city takes over the control of theater. In the condition of imperial government, it's a little bit problematic, because the city is obliged to take control of the theater, right? It's not their own initiative, so to say, in some specific way. However, there is always a way to resist it. So the theater is a commercial enterprise, and if there is not enough audience, it ends in bankruptcy. And it's often the case with those imposed theatrical troops in Kyiv. And we will come to this couple of times, but it's also a kind of a way of popular resistance to very didactic to very politically controlling function of theater and kind of popular demand of entertainment. So we'll see this conflict very often. I also charted an article which I proposed to read to you before this talk about the role of theater later in 1870s, 1880s, nationalizing or entertaining, and all the debates about this sphere. In the particular Russian intellectual context, theater for a long time is perceived as popular school, школа народная. This is a phrase from Catherine II, and for her, theater was to play important educational, didactic function. That wasn't absolutely kind of unique or original Russian imperial idea. That, of course, stems in the atmosphere of the Enlightenment. In the conditions of the Russian Empire, there was kind of growing attention to the theater because the idea was that theater can divert various segments of population from any kind of subversive action, conspiracies, political conspiracies. And in the context of contested borderlands, like Western borderland, the theater as didactic institution was to play nationalizing role. And which kind of theater can do it was, of course, the Russian drama theater. So that was a kind of priority of the imperial policy. Let's subsidize serious Russian drama theater. And this idea was actually supported by a significant part of Russian intelligentsia. In Kiev, in imperial centers, the Russian drama theater was to be this школа народная, popular school, right? Because it could educate various segments of population in different ways. The problem was that the attempts to install Russian drama theater for many, many times ended in bankruptcy. The French vaudeville, the Italian itinerant operatic troops, the local Polish-Russian operatic troops, itinerant troops, were much more successful. So all this musical, comic entertainment could, of course, survive without subsidies, without big subsidies from the center, while the drama theater could not really do it. So if you look just on the kind of quick chronology of the city theater and musical theater in Kyiv through the 19th century, we could see three different phases. So the first would be, if we divide it according to the theatrical building, theatrical institution of certain building as important center. So the first would be this wooden theater, but then in the 1850s, a new stone theater was constructed because of, again, imperial subsidy. We can see a couple of descriptions of it. It's interesting that that theater was conceived in a kind of cosmopolitan Italian way. So the decorations were to represent Italian landscapes, and always this turn to non-Russian, non-Polish, but some kind of European cosmopolitan musical art was an attempt to find some reapproachment, Polish-Russian reapproachment, some common ground, some neutral ground. So the idea was for a long time that, okay, it can be a neutral theatrical ground for various segments of public. Again, the theater was rather planned for nobility, for land-owning elite at that time, still in 1850s, because it could host about 800 people. Out of them, 500-something were to sit in boxes, in theatrical boxes. So there were about 70 theatrical boxes planned in this small building. So more than half were to be kind of separated in their boxes, which obviously this interior structure indicates also social hierarchy, represents also social hierarchy and social structure. This actually was the site where then the new operatic theaters were established and the kind of site of contestation, right? It existed until the 1890s, just to give you a perspective. So it burned out as it happened to many operatic theaters in Europe at that time. And then by the beginning of the 20th century, we have a new building built by, again, with strong imperial subsidy by the project of Victor Schroeter, who was imperial architect who designed also theaters in Petersburg and also in other provincial centers. And then at that time when it was built at the beginning of the 20th century, the idea was that the building would represent Russian architectural style. Together with Russian churches, together with other architectural forms, the idea was that that would represent the historical style which is important for Russian art in the province. This is actually the theater where Russian Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin was assassinated in 1911. But let's come back to the middle of the 19th century. If Russian imperial government was somehow to oppose the Polish predominance in the city, the idea was to build loyal cultural group out of urban dwellers. So somehow have a kind of balance between the landowning elites that were not always present in the city and the urban dwellers. With the imperial reforms of the 1860s, 1870s, there is a huge urban growth. There are emergence of representatives of free professions, of intelligentsia in the city. City grew tremendously, actually, from 50,000 in the middle of the 19th century to 300,000 at the beginning of the 20th century. So, in fact, there is a kind of urban explosion. And the idea is of the imperial government that by installing certain urban cultural institutions, the identity of the city would be shaped. However, that was a very complex relationship because, on the other hand, the city could influence the imperial policies, and there was always certain autonomy in the local cultural politics. I'm showing this map just to indicate that city was also important for the urban growth, because actually this second stone building which I just showed was part of a new quarter of the city where this discovered Golden Gates, newly established University of Kiev was located. So in a way they represented the new Russian dimension of the city. So who would be these actors on the stage of local cultural politics? Well, that would be provincial government, and very often the general governors of the province were directly involved. So we could see a couple of them who were really important in the theatrical politics. But then there would be also various types of theatrical figures, directors, cultural activists representing local musical society, authors of reviews in the newspapers, and so on. So here we have directors of Kyiv City Theatre or local musical activists who contributed their articles. But then what also was interesting, that in spite of kind of rather strong censorship and lack of representative institutions, the local press was quite dynamic and often quite independent. So for me as historian, the local discussions in the press are probably the most interesting sources, specifically from the time when we have this representative of free professions, lawyers, educators, who often represent kind of non-dominant groups of city population. And here I would like just to show two friends who represented Ukrainian and Jewish part of Kyiv population, Pavlo Andrievsky and Lev Kupernik, both very active theatrical activists and also theatrical reviewers. So the probably central moment, I'll in a moment explain why you see these pictures, probably the central moment for the imperial cultural policy was the establishing of Russian opera in Kyiv in 1867. It was probably the first provincial permanent opera, because, as I mentioned before, the itinerant operatic troops were from time to time present in Kyiv. And of course, there were many operatic performances in Kyiv already from the 1820s and so on. But in the 1867, there was permanent operatic troupe with permanent budget, and clearly it was declared as Russian opera. So that was the first provincial opera beyond the imperial theaters in St. Petersburg and Moscow that emerged in the Russian Empire. It was opened in October 1868, 1867, and it was seen as a kind of turning point in the cultural life of the city. The goal of the government was to undermine the presence of Polish theater and also to undermine the presence of Italian operatic music in the city. To do it, first the Russian drama theater was installed in the theatrical building. It ended in bankruptcy. Also it played new progressive plays by Ostrovsky and others, but still there was not enough financial basis for it. And then as a kind of a compromise between those segments of urban society that demanded more entertaining musical theater and government that wanted to have Russian theater, the idea of establishing Russian opera emerged. Let's have it musical theater, but in Russian language, but in Russian institutional form. So by that time, by the end of the 1860s, we have a huge national tendency in the Russian music. We have already a group of Russian composers, mighty handful. We have establishing of Russian musical society and conservatories. And there are several important operatic works that could create the repertory of such a theater. And they were planned to be performed in Kiev. And normally, the kind of main opener of theatrical season, the most representative Russian opera would be, of course, opera by Glinka, Alive for the Tsar. Very kind of politically strong musical piece of art based on the early 17th century story of Russian-Polish war and Russian peasants' resistance to Polish gentry noble army that tries to occupy the contemporary Russia, Tsardom of Muscovy. Ivan Susanin, as you probably have heard the name from other stories, a paradigmatic figure. So an opera built on musical dichotomy of Polonaise and folkloric Russian music, very much kind of exactly dichotomized, so to say, and in the context of 1860s, the opera that could be perceived as a national imperial manifesto, as a manifesto of nationalizing empire. Because again, we're talking about the 1860s, it's already after the Polish January uprising. However, in the case of Kiev, not Glinka's Alive for the Tsar was the first opera performed on the stage of this newly established Russian theater, but the older and in a way more amateurish work by Alexei Verstovsky, a composer from the first half of the 19th century, The Askold Grave, the opera based on the story of Zagoskin, the opera which can actually not be classified as grand opera, which rather would be seen as singing opera, Singspiel, with rather this traditional operatic character, but still very popular at that time. So question could be, of course, why? And answer would be very obvious, because the Askold Grave is located in Kyiv, and the whole opera is about the local Kyiv topography. So the opera would be about the 10th century, late 9th century, developments, arrival of Rurikids to the Kyiv, establishing of medieval Kyiv Rus. The place of Askold Grave was, you could see here drawings by Taras Shevchenko, Vasily Tim, from the 19th century, was already a kind of romanticized symbolic place with a church built on the alleged grave of Prince Askold, and also alleged first worshipping place of early Christians, attended from time to time by imperial dignitaries, including emperor. And what was kind of interesting about this opera, that it consisted of music that by that time was already recognized as representative of the Russian music. So I am I'm not a musicologist, and here I can just rely on the analysis of musicologists, because that's actually an interesting question. How a certain piece of music is classified as representing that national tradition or another national tradition, why it's representational. And I could just follow Marina Frolova-Walker, who argued that these songs from Verstovsky opera were built on existing urban salon romances, so-called Russian Romance style, existing by that time. It was not directly borrowed from the folkloric songs. So in kind of Russian musical tradition, this long-drawn, протяжная, peasant song was seen as most characteristic of the folkloric song. And some elements of it were incorporated here, but what's also interesting that actually the base for many musical elements was the lyric polonaise. So the same polonaise which was masterfully used by Glinka to create this Russian-Polish sense of conflict in A Life for the Tsar, here was actually still used as a kind of representative Russian motif, Russian structure. And maybe just to entertain you a little bit, let me play a fragment from it. I hope it will work. So this fragment is the girls' choir that are kept at the palace by Prince Sviatoslav in the third act. And also generally this opera was perceived as part of rather cosmopolitan operatic production, having a lot of common, for example, with Karl Maria Weber's, their Freischütz, and others, but some parts were seen as representative of Russianness. And for example, other important Russian composer, Serov, claimed that it represented the soul of the Russian woman, none less than arias from Glinka's operas, and so on. And what's also interesting that by that time, by the 1860s, many elements of this opera were already reproduced in various kind of mechanical forms, so to say. So one could play some recordings already then, and so they were recognizable even outside of the theatrical setting. So all in all, the opera was an attempt to represent the mythical description of pre-Polish, medieval, Kievan state on the streets of Kyiv, connected to existing topography in Kyiv, and somehow to incorporate the local tradition, the local folklore tradition in the all-Russian culture. If you're familiar with the works of Nikolai Gogol, Mykola Gogol, and other authors, the Ukrainian school in the Russian literature and Russian culture is a very important trend which exactly worked on incorporation of Ukrainian tradition seen only as regional tradition into kind of all-national pan-Russian tradition. And here, for example, this painting of Ivan Kramskoy, based on Gogol, Mayskaya Noch, is also kind of representing this kind of specific imaginary of Ukraine through the lenses of the Russian literature and Russian representation, right? Obviously, also A Life for the Tsar was performed on the stage of Kyiv Russian opera. Here we see the father of famous composer Stravinsky, Fyodor Stravinsky, playing Ivan Susanin. But after a while, the repertoire nevertheless became cosmopolitan. The only difference was that these operas were performed in Russian translation. So the operatic theater, the Russian opera, managed to kind of marginalize Polish theater, but the new and very dangerous enemy appeared, and that enemy was the operetta. Already in 1868, operetta emerged on the stage, on the musical stage of Kyiv. Offenbach became more and more and more popular. And also the operetta was also performed in Russian. For many critics, it didn't really have desired nationalizing effect, even if it is translated into Russian. So many of these plays were translated into Russian and then performed in Kyiv even before they were performed in St. Petersburg or Moscow. So Kyiv was quite kind of attuned to the newest musical works in Europe. And as a result of it, the musical stage rather became operatic stage. I'll show you now just an example of 1 year season. So if you look at the most popular operas in Kyiv City Theatre in 81, we would see here in the first place actually Zuppe, operetta, then only a few of Rubinstein, Anton Rubinstein Demon, of Russian operas. And obviously there are some Russian operas in Kyiv City Theatre, but they made no more than 15% of all performances. And who dominated the repertoire were the operetta. So many of them were not performed many times, just 3 or 4 times. Here we have the list of the most successful, but altogether in that year they made about 40% of what one could see on the city musical stage. That was a very tricky question, because in order to survive, the theatrical entrepreneurs still needed the official subsidy from the government. And to get the subsidies, they had to argue that we are an important Russian institution that Russifies the city and the region, so please give us money. But as soon as they got money, they tried to have more successful plays, and rather to answer the popular demand. And that again became the subject of continuous discussions and debates in the press. The other important problem was that the theatrical troupe didn't really have exclusively Russian character. When the Russian opera was opened, before the Russian opera was opened, the local troops can recruit second-rate Italian singers or maybe Polish singers for Polish troupe from Austrian Galicia even. With the opening of the Russian opera troupe in permanent Russian opera theater in Kiev, they had to look for those singers who could sing in Russian somehow, right? And often they would be of various national backgrounds, but they had to have some experience of singing in imperial theaters in St. Petersburg or Moscow. Still, if they were to represent the Russian culture, if they were to kind of show the audience the mythologized mirror of what it meant to be Russian in Kiev at that time, they were not Russian enough to the taste of newspaper observers and commentators. Let me just quote a couple of criticism from the official press in Kiev. Mrs. Abrasi doesn't have a strong enough voice for the part of Natalia in the opera Oprichnik by Tchaikovsky. She is too cold, and her appearance doesn't correspond to the image of a Russian girl. Or, what kind of a boy Vanya or princess in Rusalka is she if she doesn't have a deep, low voice? In both roles, Raffaele, obviously Italian singer, is not a Russian boy and is not a Russian princess, but an Italian in Russian costume, an Italian who very unskillfully uses the Russian tongue. The criticism could be also against the Polish singers like Mrs. Fabianskaya, who had to go to Petersburg to speak Russian properly, but who still can be spotted as not standardly Russian. And then there was a big influx of singers of Jewish background. With the growth of anti-Semitism in Russia after 1880s, their improper, so-called, pronunciation was constantly object of attack of very loyalistic or chauvinistic commentators in the press. I'm already talking for too long, but I still need a couple of minutes, so let me just jump into still other competitor on the musical stage of Kyiv. That is the Ukrainian itinerant theater, which appeared from time to time in the form of semi-amateur performances, like here in 1874, or later itinerant troops would come to Kyiv and perform for some period Ukrainian musical plays. Ukrainian theater was part of a general national populistic agenda of Ukrainian intelligentsia of that time. The culture was to serve popular masses, to represent popular masses, to accurately show them to the educated elite. So therefore, accurate ethnographic, realistic representation of peasantry was valued, or of historical details, was very valuable. In the political climate of the Russian Empire, this kind of ethnographic Ukrainianness was probably the only possible way for manifestation of Ukrainian identity after 1860s, because being afraid of possible separatistic tendencies, Ukrainian language publications were first forbidden for schools in 1863, and then generally Ukrainian publications were forbidden in 1875. So-called M's Ukaz even forbade Ukrainian theatrical performances and publication of lyrical scores in musical works in Ukrainian. But then that total ban was lifted, and at the beginning of the 1880s, at some moment of liberalization, the permanent Ukrainian troupe could perform in Kiev for some time with quite a big success, playing rather ethnographic musical plays or melodramatic musical plays centered on the life of Ukrainian countryside, on the life of Ukrainian peasantry. So somehow theater set the standard of national costume, of national music, of national appearances. These actors normally would also play in Russian operatic or Russian opera troupes. We can compare them to the ethnographic description of Ukrainian peasants near Kyiv from 1840s. So in a way, yes, some important symbolic elements were then incorporated into kind of standard theatrical costume. Obviously, they didn't take into account the modernization of Ukrainian village, of Ukrainian countryside in the second half of the 19th century. So somehow they kind of, they represented frozen, right, representation, Ukrainian ethnographic representation. But probably the most challenging question for the Ukrainian theater was to be seen as a serious competitor, as a serious musical theater. Because most of its repertory, again, consisted of light musical plays, of vaudevilles, of operetta. Many of the singers were also operetta singers. And in this way, it was kind of standardly perceived from the time of Gogol as part of, as a kind of provincial, comic part of all Russian national culture. With the intensification of national processes and emergence new generation of positivist and then radical intelligentsia, the idea was to rewrite operettas into real operas and to stage them as real operas on the Kyiv musical stage. Here, in a certain way, Ukrainian theater faced the same problem, that the most popular and the most kind of successful among the public were actually these light musical plays, these old operettas of the beginning of the 19th century, representing in semi-comical way peasant characters, and new modernist operettas or new more serious operas, not operas, new serious operas, met with less interest. So here I have, for example, their repertoire from 1882, and again you could see, I don't have time to go into every play, that mostly these light musical genres were dominating. Here again there was an attempt to use folkloristic elements for this national musical representation. Let me again show you a little bit of performance of music. This is amateur, actual or semi-amateur performance, recorded just a couple of years, just 10 years ago. But I would like just to entertain you a little bit with music that became perceived as a kind of Ukrainian theatrical music. This is written by amateur musician, gymnasium teacher Petro Nieszczyński in 1870. Okay, I didn't check. Just a moment. I'll probably just... Okay. Sorry for this. Okay, I'll switch it off. And let's hope now you'll see. it's, of course, entertaining to watch it further. Maybe more entertaining than listen to my presentation, but I have to stop here and return to the presentation and just the concluding final part. Meanwhile, while it's opening, let me just comment what we just saw. So that's the kind of paradigmatic part of urban of Ukrainian peasant culture, so-called evening gatherings, večerníci, described often by works of Hohol and other Ukrainian writers. You probably know the famous painting by Repin, also representing this element of the peasant entertainment. The idea of this theatrical performance was somehow to dress into the nation's dress, right? So not only the actors or singers would come into these costumes, peasant costumes, showing the proper national way to the audience, but also very often the audience would dress into ethnographic national costumes. And after the performance, often the educated intelligentsia would also entertain themselves by organizing some kind of večerníci, right? Singing the same songs and so on. So that was, of course, important for self-identification, for internalizing some elements of peasant culture in this form of more kind of modern operetta, of kind of modern cosmopolitan form. And that's what I'm just finishing with it, the kind of most prominent Ukrainian composer of that time, Mykola Lysenko, was engaged in writing modern European works of music, but on the basis of folkloric music. Obviously, he was not alone in this tendency. There were many composers in East Central Europe who did the same. And actually, the other important composer from the time, Piotr Tchaikovsky, I'm using here not their standard pictures of fathers of national music, but they are photographs from earlier period when they actually were actively writing music in 1870s. Tchaikovsky was also trying to incorporate some of Ukrainian folkloric elements into Russian opera. Both composers were in good relationship and trying to almost of the same age, but somehow they ended as representatives of two different national styles. Let me jump to conclusions or to a couple of statements instead of conclusions. What is important to mention here is, of course, that the dynamic of urban musical life has its independence. And the predominant tendency was interest in contemporary European musical theater, in operetta theater, in new forms of entertainment. The nationalized theater attracted interest of big segment of theatrical society, but still rather of limited segment of theatrical society. Obviously, under certain context, when, for example, there were semi-prohibited performances of Ukrainian itinerant theater, there was possibility to gather the whole theatrical audience in national dress as a kind of national manifestation. The Polish theater later also reappeared in Kiev, and in the beginning of the 20th century, it also played this national representational role. And with the Jewish theater, it was, of course, a little bit different because there were constant anti-Jewish legislative measures, but there were some attempts to revive Jewish popular theater in Kyiv before the First World War. The establishment of Russian opera was an important moment, and it contributed to the shaping of this kind of Russian character, urban character of Kyiv before the First World War, but still the cultural public of the city preserved its kind of polycentric, its diverse character, and it still would be an open question to what extent this cultural project, nationalizing imperial project of making inhabitants of Kyiv true Russians through the musical forms, was a success or failure before the First World War. With this maybe open question, I'm ending this long talk, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for giving us such a, I think, a multifaceted insight also in Kiev's urban life in the 19th century and the way, musical theater and theatrical spaces can play very different roles in different times. So the floor is open to questions now. And actually, I have a first question, if I may. I would be interested if we know anything about the public who went to visit the different sorts of musical theater and of theater in general. Was it more, did it have a family character also, that was it a place to see and to be seen? Did that change over time?
That's obviously the central question, and I apologize that I didn't pay any attention to it in my talk, because it's actually was the object of various cultural policies. And what is interesting that in Kiev regularly the plural form was used. Theatrical publics or cultural publics of Kiev. So even officials, even administrators realized that there is not only one public. And that was also the way to somehow undermine the position of the Polish high elite public in the city. So as the theater was built, it was meant basically for the Polish gentry families. That's why there were these boxes, and normally they were subscribed by the gentry families, and so on. But that was the 1850s and 1860s. With the establishing of Russian opera theater in the main city theater, the public, of course, changed, and there were many officials, bureaucrats, military officers, Russian intelligentsia, activists, who were expected to be making the main public. But still, through the end of the 19th century, there was obvious kind of, let's call it, democratization or change of genre hierarchy in the theater. And with the introduction of operetta, the character of public also democratized. So actually this introduction of operetta was some kind of answer to the intensive urbanization of the city. There were many patronizing comments in the press about how the public behaves in the operatic performances, that operetta allows for all type of subversive behavior, not only because of its bad taste and eroticization and everything, but somehow it opened theatrical space also to various type of the break of sexual norms and societal norms and politeness and everything. But it also indicates that that was quite dynamic, actually. So the public was diverse. Sometimes it can be nationally, in a way, defined, but as a rule, it was not nationally defined. And probably the most important was certain unavoidable democratization of, as everywhere in Europe, actually, in Eastern Europe. So there were attempts to keep this opera theater as a kind of elite institution, but until at least the end of the 19th century, they were not successful. Later, with the diversification of musical stage in the city, yes, and the growth of the city, yes, the opera got more predominant role in the main city theater.
And the musical theater went elsewhere.
Yes, yes, there were other, yes, and there were other theatrical stages.
I have a question. Thank you very much for your enlightened talk. I have a question concerning the rivalry between different cities in Ukraine. So you mentioned, or you emphasized that the Kiev theater was one of the first imperial theaters outside of Petersburg and Moscow. And I'm wondering which was the relationship with Odessa, who also had a very early theater built by Thomas Thomas, famous architect from Petersburg, and later got a new theater by the Austrian architect studio Fellner and Hell.
Geimer, yes.
Still existing. And so could you point a bit on the difference between the two cities and which part had the nationalization in Odessa compared to Kiev?
Absolutely, very good possibility for me, exactly thanks to your question, to comment a little bit on this. That's actually very interesting, that two cities, the largest cities in Ukraine at that time, if you look at the Russian-controlled part of Ukraine, and Odessa is actually larger than Kyiv before the First World War, and the largest city in Ukraine, but the two cities played absolutely different symbolic role in the popular imagination. And as Kyiv was charged with this kind of historical center of Russia and so on, Odessa was kind of perceived and allowed to be rather a cosmopolitan, exotic, dynamic city on the outskirts of the empire, southern city, right? The Jewish character of urban life, of urban culture in Odessa, was, of course, a big problem in the moment of regular anti-Semitic policy, and we know that there were very terrible pogroms in Odessa in 1881 and then in 1905, but at the same time, Odessa was rather perceived as a specific case, and the theatrical stage in Odessa was rather cosmopolitan, was Italian and French. So through the 19th century, the operatic troops from Odessa would perform in Kiev, and they normally would be Italian operatic troops that were existing within Russian Empire, traveling within the borders of Russian Empire. Some of the singers would travel back to Western Europe and then to Russian Empire, but the theater in Odessa could be non-Russian, so for the whole 19th century, and that's how Odessa had its own independent theatrical history. So clearly it was in a way more integrated into European musical life than Kyiv through the 19th century. Then the other Ukrainian cities, if you ask this question, they also had interesting theatrical stories. The cities on the western bank of the Dnipro River would be again rather Polish before the 1860s and then Russified after the 1860s. And these theaters would often have would rather belong to a kind of theatrical sphere that would also encompass Warsaw, include Austrian Galicia, so include the other Polish territories. The theaters on the eastern side of Dnipro River, so Poltava, Kharkiv specifically, had some, at the beginning, had some local Ukrainian elements, but then developed into, in a way, comparable stories. So in a way, the Kharkiv's theater, in a way, developed similarly to Kyiv, but simply Kyiv received much stronger attention of the imperial center and much bigger subsidy and could have more kind of visible operatic stage. And Kharkiv remained rather as important, but not so symbolically important center of the Russian Empire. But the question requires longer answer, and there are many more nuances to add to it, so that's just very rough answer.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Maybe if I can, I would just maybe add one sentence at the very beginning. This seemingly kind of 19th century distant story has a lot of repercussion in nowadays intellectual and public debates in Ukraine because of Russian aggression and because of the agenda of decolonization and the question of the relationship between Ukrainian culture and Russian culture, the re-evaluation of Russian culture as it is presented. So there are different opinions and quite a strong polarization in nowadays Ukrainian intellectual life. That could be probably interesting topic for another lecture. The reaction of society to unprecedented conditions of war and the reaction of intellectuals and cultural figures. There is, for example, ongoing debate whether conservatory in Kiev should be named after Pyotr Tchaikovsky, who was actually partly of Ukrainian background and who was very sympathetic to Ukrainian cultural development, but symbolically is representative of Russian culture. So the debate is, should the symbol of Russian culture still be used to name the main musical school in Kyiv, for example, as an imperial legacy, and how to deal with imperial legacy. So all these political and cultural debates from the 19th century can, of course, be seen as continuing now. But I would say that historians should also see differences between different epochs, and it's also a big now, I think, a big danger to see imperial policies as just repeating itself and national policies just repeating itself. I think there are many important lessons from the 19th century which we can learn without mythologizing 19th century as just part of that or another ideological construction.
Thank you. I think these are very good final words, and I fully agree with them. Thank you again for this presentation, which I loved very much, and I think we will continue our discussions afterwards. Für Sie alle, wir sehen uns in 2 Wochen wieder, also Sie sind nächste Woche hier eben mit Nicola Hayo. Wir sehen uns in 2 Wochen wieder, wenn es um die sowjetische Klassik geht und die Frage eben, gibt es sowas wie eine sowjetische Musik oder eine russländische Musik innerhalb der Sowjetunion in der späten Sowjetunion in den 60er bis 80er Jahren. Und dann, bis dahin wünsche ich Ihnen eine gute Zeit und einen schönen Abend.
Thank you. Yes, more or less. I cannot see my... maybe I'll just...
Could you give me the microphone?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Let me... Yeah. No, it's good.
Maybe you see it, but... okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think it worked fine.